To get started, I want to start with a little bit of background on terminology so that you understand where I'm coming from and where I'm going to go. So what is a frame? Frames are sets of choices about how information is presented, and they are built by the words that you choose, the values you endorse, what you say, what you don't say, what ideas you link together, and how you respond to the way people already think. Not only do frames matter, but I want to really emphasize here that framing is an empirical process. We can actually test what frames are going to work before we use them to make sure that we're using the right ones to get our messages across. So a really effective master frame needs elements that can shift and expand people's thinking in ways that improve public understanding and build support for policy changes. And I'm going to use an example here from our research that's on a different issue, because sometimes it's actually easier to see how this works when you're talking about something different. So this is an example of our work on framing drug and alcohol addiction in Alberta, Canada, where we worked with advocates who were trying to design or to get better policy support and public funding to address addiction issues. These are the results of an experiment we ran with a sample of 6,000 respondents in Alberta. And the black line that you see in the middle is the control group. So this represents the people who didn't receive any frame before they were asked about their support for evidence-based addiction policies. And then we tested 3 frames against this control. So we gave some people an interdependence value. So that's the idea that everyone in society relies on one another. So we all have a stake in making sure our members are healthy and strong. Another frame we gave a different group of people was ingenuity, the idea that Albertans are innovative people who can address challenges. And the last frame that we tested was empathy, which is the idea that, you should sympathize with people who are suffering from addiction. And as you can see, compared to that black line, the control line, interdependence and ingenuity had positive effects. After reading these frames, respondents demonstrated stronger support for evidence-based policies than the people who got no message. But empathy actually had the opposite effect. People were less supportive of evidence-based policies after reading an empathy frame about addiction. And unfortunately, over 90% of the communications about addiction being used at that time in Alberta were using that empathy frame. So I'm using this example to show you the ability of frames to have, in some cases, very dramatic effects on the way people do, or unfortunately in Alberta, don't understand particular issues and support policies. And to just note that sometimes our instincts about what's going to be an effective communication isn't necessarily correct. And that's because we assume that other people share our knowledge and understandings, and they don't always. But the good news is that we can find good frames by testing them, and that's what we've done for immigration. So a quick review of how we do things here at Frameworks, so you understand our approach. A lot of times the assumption is that members of the public are just blank slates. Their minds are like empty fish bowls, and you can drop your message into this fish bowl and they'll swim around happily, and the public's going to understand your issue. But what social science research demonstrates is that this is actually not the case. People's minds are more like swamps. So there's already a lot of beliefs and ideas in here, what we call cultural models. These are shared assumptions and ways of thinking that help all of us make sense of the world around us. And like a swamp, this is a very complex ecosystem. So there are things that might be dangerous to what you're talking about in your communications, like alligators that are going to eat your messages. But there's also orchids and, potentially useful understandings that could provide fertile soil for your communications. You just need to find them. So all of our research starts with mapping out this swamp and identifying the cultural models that are already in there. Here's the swamp of understanding for immigration. So this is what you're facing whenever you're creating communications or talking about immigration. And as you can see, there are a lot of alligators in here, right? So on the upper left-hand side, you see us versus them thinking. Immigrants are criminals, they're takers, they're a strain on the system. The zero-sum thinking, they're competing for our jobs. punitive thinking, which kind of understanding about the way to shape behavior is to secure the border, or you should set an example. And also fatalism in the bottom left-hand corner is a big problem when talking about immigration. However, there's also positive things in this swamp, right? So you'll see on the bottom right-hand side, there's us thinking, this sort of humanist, people are people, nation of immigrants is a very positive way of thinking about this, celebrating diversity. Pragmatism as Americans, we know we can make things work with what we have. Those are potentially very positive cultural models. I want to note also there's what we call the black box. So your average American has no idea how the immigration system works or why it works the way it does. So what happens is the public ends up filling that in with other things in that swamp. So instead of dropping just untested messages into the swamp, what we do is identify the models that you want to avoid, which ones you want to activate, and then we design strategies for communications using this approach. So we also, once we've designed the strategies, we test them using a variety of methods like that survey that I just showed you. And now I'm going to talk about a couple of things. I'm going to start by talking about a couple of things that I think you need to avoid when talking about immigration, and then I'm going to move on to ways that you should talk about immigration so that you can successfully navigate that swamp and your messages don't get eaten by those alligators. So here's another example. This actually comes from public health, but it definitely applies to many social issues and certainly applies to immigration. It's very common to try and use data to overcome swampy thinking. We try and correct people's mistakes by exposing the wrong thinking through the use of facts. You know, you're saying this, but you're wrong. Here's the information that shows you why. But a lot of social science research now shows that this sort of myth-fact warfare backfires. It drives people right back into the swamp. So this is a myth-fact sheet, and you can see how the CDC is trying to do that. And what the research has shown is that instead of refuting the myths, you're actually reinforcing them. People remember the myth, but they don't remember the fact. And not only that, they are now going to attribute the myth to you. So I've been seeing a ton of this on Twitter and social media lately, and also from policymakers around immigration statistics and things like Donald Trump's tweets. You know, people with the very best of intentions repeat the myth that immigrants commit more crime, and then they say, but the fact is they don't. Do not do that. Don't repeat the myth when you're refuting it if you can avoid it. Don't retweet Donald Trump. Start always with the fact. And if you absolutely have to repeat the myth, you can do that, but make sure it comes after the fact is presented. This is another sort of common communications trap that we've seen for a long time now when talking about immigrations, which is fixing the broken immigration system. So if you'll remember, there was that black box in the swamp of immigration where people don't understand the immigration system or how it works. And right next to that was fatalism. So when you talk about the immigration system being broken, that reinforces the sense that nothing can be done. And this ends up being really unproductive, does not get people where you want them to go, and again, just drives them back into that swamp. So what does get people where you want them to go when you're talking about immigration? Instead of using the strategies I just talked about, ideally, you would build a narrative with empirically tested frames. So this is an example of a shared prosperity narrative arc that we recommend. And a lot of people talk about how immigrants contribute to the economy and contribute to our shared prosperity. And we think that's good, but you need to build up this narrative. So in order to do that, you have to have an explanation about what is this about, why does this matter, how exactly does immigration reform enhance our prosperity, and what can we do about it? You need to have solutions. So our research showed that starting with values is actually the best way to start this narrative, and specifically starting off with a moral argument is the most effective way of shaping people's thinking and their support for effective immigration policy. So I'm going to show you a specific example of how the moral argument works and tests compared to a frame that actually does not work, which is rights-based language. So when we did our experiment on testing our immigration frames, we found that rights-based language is actually not very effective as a value when you're talking about immigration. It ends up triggering that sort of us versus them thinking in people's minds, which is not a productive way to talk about it. Instead, what we found was that starting by talking about human dignity and using the moral high ground is the best way to start talking about immigration and immigration reform. You need to give an explanation of why we care about this issue, and it's because immigrants are people just like us. So, you can see how much better the humanitarian argument tested against the rights-based argument. And the humanitarian argument is something like, no matter where we were born, we all deserve to be treated with kindness and respect, and we should all be able to live with dignity. And as you can see, the rights-based, which is in blue, just did not do nearly as well. So I want to be clear. I am not saying that you should never talk about immigrant rights. Obviously, those are very important things to talk about, but do not open your argument or your communications with it, because it doesn't mean the same thing for the public as it does for those of us who know a lot more about the immigration system. And I just want to tell a very, very quick anecdote, personal anecdote here. So I have a twin sister who is an immigration paralegal and has been for 12 or 13 years now. She knows a lot about the immigration system. She's very supportive of immigration and wants immigration reform. And one day we were listening to NPR and we heard an activist who was talking about immigrant rights and the undocumented people's right to be in the U.S. And she looked at the radio and she said, "What right? They don't have a right to be in the United States. There's nothing in the Constitution that says that." I mean, it just totally turned her off. And I think when you have language that turns off people who are your natural allies, that's an indication that it's not something that you want to start with. You need to explain why rights matter, and it's because they are humanitarian, and it's about compassion and dignity. So I'm going to show you some more specific examples of that. So, I think the moral argument is actually particularly useful right now in arguing against the Trump administration's most recent policy changes, because it emphasizes our common humanity and compassion, and this is a really effective counterpoint to what we've been seeing. So talking about how we have to treat everyone with the compassion they deserve as human beings, how everyone is entitled to the same basic respect, demonstrating how the current system, and in particular the most recent policies, don't recognize immigrants' humanity, that keeping families apart is not something that we should be doing as a country, and connecting reform and immigration reform to that ability to fulfill our moral obligation to other human beings. Everybody should be treated with compassion, and that should be the goal of our immigration reform, not punishment. So that being said, you need to be prepared to be flexible when you're making your arguments. When you're in a contested situation, like in a town hall or in a conversation with somebody who wants to build a border wall, we found, and we tested this in our experiment, that pivoting to a pragmatism value actually works best. And I've seen this value actually used pretty well by some advocates and policymakers recently when they're talking about sanctuary cities. So let me give you a few examples of what that looks like. So this is where you're appealing to common sense and to practical measures and talking about how we need, common sense, practical approaches, and that gives us the best chance of improving our country. Again, I think this is a really effective counterpoint to the anti-immigration rhetoric that we're hearing right now. They start talking about building a wall and deporting people, and you start talking about how we need common sense and practical solutions that are not going to cost us billions of dollars and tear families apart, right? So pointing out how those proposals are just not practical, and then always highlighting the feasibility of reform. Remember, we don't want people to go back to fatalism. So then you need to talk about what the reasonable steps are towards solutions. So instead of building a wall, let's provide a pathway to citizenship, which is something that we know a majority of Americans already support. So I'm going to end on this slide, which has sort of a series of, I hope, very useful and applicable recommendations on what not to do and what to do instead. And these are sort of common traps that we come across. So out of the shadows. This is an incredibly common way of describing undocumented people, but our research shows this is really not a good way to talk about the undocumented, because if you think about what's in the shadows, it's criminals, it's monsters, it's vampires. People don't associate shadows with good things, so it's really counterproductive. And instead, you should be talking about an outdated immigration system that needs to be updated so that people can live their lives productively and be fully integrated members of American society. Worthy, deserving immigrants is another very easy trap for us to fall into, but this again reinforces that sort of us versus them thinking. You always want to emphasize that we want immigration reform and effective immigration policies for all immigrants, both because it is the compassionate, moral thing to do, and because immigrants live in families and communities with mixed legal statuses, right? So undocumented immigrants might have citizen children. Many of them do. You know, DACA recipients might have siblings who can't get DACA because of the way our immigration system is structured. And this is why it's always critical to tell a system story and not just an individual story. So when you leave out that broader context, people might feel sympathy for that one individual and think, well, they're a good person, but then they don't extend it out to the rest of their family or their community or their group, right? So you always want to make sure that you're talking about the system that creates conditions for people and not just people's individual attributes. And that's how you get the public to recognize what the system is and then support effective, compassionate policies for all immigrants. Broken immigration system, we already talked about. You know, don't bring up broken immigration system. It pushes people back into that swamp of fatalism. These data speak for themselves. I think if this election has taught us one thing, it's that facts don't speak for themselves. You have to embed facts in frames and in wider narratives using those values and the narrative arc that we talked about. You know, saying the data show how compassionate immigration reform will move us all forward as a country, as opposed to just sort of throwing out those data points and letting people make of it what they will. As we saw, you know, they have all these understandings and assumptions already, and you want to make sure you're cueing the positive ones. As I said, rights not work very well as a value. You can talk about rights, but don't start with rights. Start with that moral argument. Try to avoid talking about immigrants as separate from other immigrations. It's not just a problem for population X, right? What affects immigrants affects all of us in the United States, because immigrants are our neighbors, they're our friends, they're our parents, they're our coworkers, they're our schoolmates. They are part of the fabric of our community. So re-emphasizing that as much as you can. And always try and offer a solution. I mean, I realize sometimes communications are short and it can be hard to get the solution in there, but always try and get to that solution. When you have that complete narrative, people will stay with you. If you don't have that solution, people tend to slide back into the swamp. Remember that the public has no idea how the immigration system works and what the consequences are. And that can actually be a good thing for your communications because it creates room for informing people. But you have to be strategic and tell a system story and end with solutions. So I just have one last, but I think very critical point, which is that frames work best in high doses. You know, when everyone in a field is using the same frames and values, whether they're talking about refugees or the undocumented or DACA recipients or H-1B visas, when you're all using the same ways of talking about immigration, this can have a very powerful impact on reshaping the public conversation. It needs to be repeated over and over and over again. And it also will bring, all these different organizations who are interested in ultimately the same thing, which is compassionate, comprehensive immigration reform, together. When you're talking together using the same frames, it really does bring you together onto the same page in terms of what you're trying to pursue. So that is my presentation, and thank you all very much, and I'm really looking forward to our discussion.
So Marisa, while you get your camera working, I hope to join a conversation that we're going to have in a few seconds. I wanted to just ask a couple questions before we go to the bigger conversation. Hi, good to see you.
Sure. Hi.
I liked some of the main themes that you had. Someone asked about changing minds. You just said that repeated messages, that it has to be repeated, it has to come from many quarters in order for that changing of the minds to start to happen when you're talking en masse. The other thing is, I think a lot of attendees feel as though we're living in just a different country right now, in a different place where the mindset has just gone haywire that they don't recognize, and you have public officials, elected officials calling people criminals and these kinds of words. Please remind us of the big middle, the unsure.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let me talk just a little bit about that cultural model swamp, right? So I do want to say, I don't think actually things have changed at all. I think there are things in that swamp that have really come to the forefront, and that's because Donald Trump and some other people, but particularly Donald Trump, has been able to sort of instinctually grab onto those cultural models and bring them to the forefront for a certain portion of the U.S. population. But the thing about cultural models, when you look at that swamp, those are things that are available in our culture actually to everybody. So when we do the interviews where we talk to people and interview them, and that forms the basis of this swamp, it's actually quite remarkable how quickly people can switch between two completely different ways of thinking. So in an interview, somebody might say something about, those illegal Mexicans are, taking away all of our jobs, but then literally in the next breath talk about, but we've always been a nation of immigrants who accept people, right? So I think it's not just that there's a middle. I think everybody in the United States has the capability of thinking about immigrants and immigration in these more positive ways, in these, more compassionate, people are people, we're pragmatic people who can make it fit ways. The important thing is that we have communications that can cue those things. And we are in a contested situation where Donald Trump and now many other members of the Republican Party are saying things that are cueing those really negative models. But I think we need to remember that people are actually quite complex and are capable of thinking in more than one way. So we need to encourage them to think in more positive ways.